key cyber vulnerabilities as your next talking point here. Can you go through some of these? And MFA is massive. We hear MFA all the time, but kind of patching as well. Just some of the small, simple things that you can do to try to just reduce your exposure just a little bit every day.
Sure. All the underwriters that we work with do vulnerability scans. Some do threat intelligence. Others go a lot more deep than the depth of their surveillance sort of underwriting tools vary. They all do the vuln scans, and they'll pick up remote. They'll pick up exposed remote panels, and that's a really big deal because if you have an exposed login panel, you're 60% more likely, to have a claim. So that's a big deal. So when they do the scan, if they pick that up, or if they pick up, some software that's out of date, or if they pick up any known vulnerabilities of CVE, they'll kick it back and either quote it with a contingency that you close that port, or we got at least one that will require the port to stay, will require the port to be hidden for at least 60 days before they'll reconsider it. The lack of MFA is a really big deal now. And so we have a couple markets on the smaller stuff that don't even ask the question, but most of the markets are coming around and asking about MFA for email access. They'll ask about MFA for remote access, and they'll ask about MFA for admin privilege. And the more likely you are to have those, the more likely you're going to get better pricing, because that's a known. They know how that impacts frequency of loss. That's easy.
Gotcha.
We talked about the phishing training. That's a great thing. Backup procedures are problematic when they're not, when they're not separated or isolated. We've seen a lot of, and also we've just seen a lot of claims where the backups just get queried by the hacking process. So they'll sit in there. I'm not a security guy, but my understanding is they'll sit in there long enough to figure out how to get into the backups. And so you have to have steps to have adequate separate backups that aren't connected to the network. That's a big deal, because a big part of underwriting is, these policies, as we'll talk about in a second, cover loss of business income if they're shut down for a period of time as a result of an event. So, having the backups ready to go mitigates that exposure.
Yeah.
Now, we talked about lack of dual control in the wire transfers. Vendors, I think if there's one thing that most insureds do a poor job of, is qualifying the risk exposure, the risk profile of their vendors. So when you have relationships with vendors, a lot of times you'll say, hey, if you're going to work with us, you have to have general liability insurance, property insurance, depending on, what they're doing, professional malpractice insurance, stuff like that. We encourage them to add cyber insurance as a requirement for vendors to do business. They have to have a cyber insurance policy, and they need to be added as additional insured on the vendor cyber policy.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so that gets kind of back to the, the vendors getting hacked. You get hacked through a vendor.
Yeah, and it's incredibly important too, because depending on the size of the vendor, that cyber insurance provider is also going to have them jump through a couple of hoops. You may not necessarily know what questions to ask, but that insurance provider is going to make sure that they have at least a few things in place to hopefully reduce their overall risk as well, not just make sure if they cause a problem that you're going to get paid. Yep. And when you're talking about poor backup procedures, we're seeing a lot of improvements on the product side as far as like identifying and quarantining potentially corrupted backup files, monitoring access controls, all that type of stuff. But it's just surprising, that there's still, depending on the organization you speak to, some are very committed to utilizing backups and being very strict about, their frequency and everything. And then some folks you meet, they just say, well, we have this and that's good enough. And, that can it's just very interesting that there are different approaches out there. So, it's just something that we see from time to time.